waste to energy facilities completely support higher front-end recycling, because we do want the higher calorific materials like the plastics, the rigid plastics, out of the waste stream to enable us to process a higher volume of waste to generate the same amount of electricity.
Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to the latest episode of Energy Unplugged. I'm Richard Howard, the Research Director at Aurora Energy Research. In this episode, we'll be focusing on waste management and energy from waste in particular, looking both at the short-term dynamics of these markets and the role of waste management in decarbonisation. In the short term, the waste sector has been impacted significantly both by COVID and Brexit, which have altered the volume of waste created, the composition of waste, and also waste flows between the UK and other countries. Thinking longer term, the waste sector has also made great strides in reducing emissions, for example, by reducing landfill and increasing recycling. But bigger questions remain, for example, the role that the waste management can play in the net zero transition. Could it be providing much needed negative emissions to help the UK balance its carbon account? I'm joined by two experts within the waste sector who I hope can help answer some of these questions. Firstly, Julia Watsford, the CEO of Enfinium, a company that was formed through the merger between Wheelabrator UK and Multifuel Energy Limited by First Sentier earlier in 2021. It's now the largest pure-play operator of energy from waste facilities in the UK. Aurora has recently been working with First Sentier on a £1.9 billion debt refinancing of 4 of the energy from waste plants in Enfinium's portfolio. I'm also joined by Chris Jonas, who's the director of Tolvik Consulting, one of the expert advisors on waste markets in the UK and Europe. Thanks both of you for joining the podcast.
Yeah, good. Nice to see you again, Richard.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Maybe we could start off, both of you just say a bit more about your two organisations and the work that you do in the energy from waste space. Maybe if we start with yourself, Julia.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So thank you for the small introduction to Enfinium. So as you said, Enfinium is the largest pure play waste to energy operator in the UK and was really formed and rebranded as Enfinium this year after First Sentier investors purchased both the Wheelabrator UK assets and the Multifuel Energy assets. So today we currently operate 4 waste to energy facilities in the UK, 2 in Ferrybridge, which are some of the largest waste to energy facilities in the UK. They process refuse-derived fuel and combined have a processing capacity of over 1.5 million tonnes per annum. We have a combined heat and power facility in Kent, which is at the Kemsley DS Smith paper mill, and provides steam through to the paper mill to support their renewable energy requirements. And we also have a facility in North Wales in Deeside, which supports the 5 member authorities of the North Wales Residual Waste Treatment Partnership and provides the capacity to process all of their municipal waste, which cannot be currently reduced, reused or recycled. We also have just reached financial close on another 2 waste to energy facilities here in the UK, an additional facility in Skelton Grange, which is 15 miles from Ferrybridge, where we've commenced construction earlier this month, and then a second facility, Kelvin, which is in the West Midlands, which will be, actually we took over construction of that site on Monday this week. So very fresh news on some new very much required waste to energy capacity in the UK.
That's great, Julia. So early December for you taking over that project. Just to give listeners a sense of the scale of your operations, then how many tonnes is it that you're treating of residual waste per annum, and how many households does that equate to roughly?
Yeah, sure. So today, our 4 facilities process 2.3 million tonnes per annum of residual waste and generate 1.8 million megawatts of partially renewable energy. And by 2026, with the additional 2 facilities and another advanced project that we're working on at the moment, we expect to be able to provide the capacity to process 3.5 million tonnes of residual waste and generate about 2.2 million megawatt hours of partially renewable energy.
Okay, that's actually a very significant proportion of the overall tonnage of residual waste in the UK, if my maths is correct.
Yeah, I think if you look at where we are on the leaderboard at the moment, and maybe Chris can correct me, but I believe, when you look at total capacity across the major players, we are the 4th largest in the UK. So it is a significant volume, and it really is based around the strategic location of our facilities and the amount of waste arisings in those local areas.
Okay. And Chris, maybe you could say a few words on the work that your organisation does in this space.
We're an advisory consulting organisation. We spent many years working both in and supporting the main investors, lenders, operators within the waste markets. Our key work is tracking and tracing where the black bag rubbish runs around the UK and Northern Europe. And across Northern Europe, we also do some work in food waste and waste wood biomass. So, very much tracking in who's got control of the waste, where it's all going to, where the pressures are in the market, where the opportunities in the market, so we can provide organisations like Julia's and other organisations, debt providers, equity investors in the sector about what the opportunities are. And of course, we've had a very busy few years, both in terms of new build energy from waste plants, but also ongoing M&A activity in terms of the asset base that's currently operational.
Well, there's certainly a lot of expertise we can draw on then from both of you in the rest of the podcast, and I hope to cover sort of 2 main topics of discussion. One being about really the state of the energy from waste market in the UK and sort of wider across Europe. So thinking about the impact of Brexit, of COVID and other developments that are going on in the space, really thinking about how investable is it for people coming in to this sector, and then kind of thinking much more longer term, obviously with an eye on net zero and decarbonisation targets, as always. It's interesting to think through what is the role of energy from waste in that context, or actually the waste sector more broadly. What is it that the waste sector can contribute in of itself to reduce its emissions? And I think we'll bring the conversation even further to think about, can energy from waste with CCS even provide negative emissions, so helping to balance off emissions in other sectors, which seems to be rising up the agenda as a topic in waste discussions of late. But let's come right back to the short term. And I suppose one question I had is really about how COVID has been affecting waste markets and particularly energy from waste over the last 18, 24 months or so. How has that changed the nature of your activities in the waste sector? Has it changed the volumes of waste, the types of waste? And maybe, Chris, you can comment from a top-down perspective. And then, Julia, what has it been like at the sharp end of running these facilities? How has that worked in a time of COVID?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, we have about 27 million tonnes of residual waste in the UK. That's been broadly static for the past few years. The recycling rates of the household waste recycling we do have been broadly static, meaning that we've got a pretty stable amount of waste. Clearly, that dipped a little bit in 2020. Our working patterns all changed. The hospitality sector is a big generator of waste in 2020, 2021 was closed for much of that time. So we reduced the amount of waste we had by about 5%, about 1 million tonnes. But actually, most of the waste to energy plants in the UK maintain their operating base load, and the effects are felt at some of the more marginal parts of the industry, such as landfill and exports of some of our black bag rubbish to Europe. Clearly, the amount of household waste we have at home. A lot of people been working at home has increased substantially, but also some of the places people go to at weekends to offload some of their residual waste has closed. So actually, it's a broadly similar number, whereas some of the commercial and industrial waste volumes did fall during the year, but have bounced back pretty quickly right now. And in fact, looking at some indices of food manufacturing and sandwich making and things such as that, a lot of those establishments are now back to normal, particularly in suburban areas, maybe less so in the city stations and in the city in places, but certainly broadly we're expecting recovery of volumes pretty much back by next year, certainly the year after, in terms of what dropped off of that million tons last year.
So the volume's kind of back to where it was. Is the type of waste the same, Julia, and the waste that you're receiving at your energy from waste facilities?
So we saw, very consistent deliveries across the period. And really what we have seen as the largest impact of COVID is an increase in the calorific value of the fuel. And what that means is that waste to energy facilities are ultimately paid for every ton of waste which is disposed at our facility. And every ton of waste has a heating value, which ultimately gets converted into the electricity. Things like plastics have a higher CV value, so therefore you can process less of them to generate the same amount of electricity. Where material that has a higher organic component or a higher moisture content will have a lower CV, so you process more of that to generate the same electrical output. So as household behaviour changed, as restaurants shut down, as C&I manufacturers had to change their behaviour, we did see a shift in the waste composition, such that there was a lot more of the higher calorific value fuel, so things like Amazon boxes and plastics and other materials that may have previously been recycled, ending up in the waste stream. And we've seen that actually remain fairly sustained over the last 18 to 24 months. And I think, again, it's the change in behaviour that we're seeing around what waste is now becoming household waste versus what was C&I waste historically.
So this is a sort of slightly counterintuitive aspect of the energy from waste sector, that because the plants can only produce that much electricity, the higher the sort of calorific value of the waste stream, it's almost worse for you in a sense, because you can take fewer tons of waste, and that's your bigger revenue stream. It's less about the energy sales, it's more about the waste and gate fees. It's like the sort of perverse thing for people to get their heads around from kind of where I'm sitting. But with that, I mean, just thinking about it kind of operationally, does having a higher calorific value, does that mean you run your plant differently? That's one aspect I'm interested in. I'm also interested in how has COVID just affected the day-to-day operations? Were people able to come to these facilities? Were you still able to do the collections? How is it? It must have had huge impacts on the sector.
Yeah, so I think, the first point is, the one that is the most important, right, is that waste to energy facilities completely support higher front-end recycling, because we do want the higher calorific materials like the plastics, the rigid plastics, out of the waste stream to enable us to process a higher volume of waste to generate the same amount of electricity. The issue that we also see when you have a higher amount of plastics in the waste stream, in the combustion process, you have a much higher level of chloride. And the chlorides actually lead to a much higher degree of corrosion and erosion in the boiler as you're processing as well, which has had, at some of our facilities, operational impacts on us being required to do maintenance works earlier than we would have expected. Particularly at our Kemsley facility, where that facility started accepting waste on the 16th of March 2020 in the middle of COVID, and then reached commercial operations on the 16th of July. That facility has always operated in a COVID environment. And when you see the actual combustion, flue gas, chemistry, it's very different than what we would have expected. And that's as a result of having the higher materials, the higher calorific value materials in the waste stream. From an operational perspective, it's been a couple of years. I think as we started to realize lockdown coming into place, what did that mean for our 24/7 operators that need to be working on shifts, coming from different parts of the UK to certain locations. In particular, our facility in Wales, we had a lot of people that live in the UK, in England, getting into Wales. What were the transportation options for those types of people? How were we going to manage 24/7 operations if people did get sick with COVID in a facility and weren't able to leave? So we had to adjust pretty quickly. We put in place a lot of kind of action attack processes where we looked at actually bringing bedding and food and masses of equipment onto the facility, such that if we had to run a single shift for 2 weeks, we were able to do so to continue the operations. Thankfully, we didn't get to that, and waste to energy was defined as an essential service because of the role that we play, both in supporting sustainable waste management, but ultimately clearly being an electricity generator, and we just had to adapt. I think the team have been incredibly resilient. People have had to pick up additional shifts when people had to self-isolate. But everyone's really come together and worked well to ensure that we can continue to deliver our essential service.
Lots and lots of issues to wrestle with there, but hopefully that's all moving in the right direction. I want to move us on to think about how the patterns of trade of waste have changed, particularly with an eye on any impact from Brexit. Now, I remember from research I did previously on waste sector going back a few years now, we used to have a feature of the market, which is the UK exported a significant volume, if I remember, around 3 million tons of waste to Europe, and probably more to other countries such as China that were processing some of our recycling streams. Chris, maybe to bring you in, how has that changed, or to what extent has that changed, and is that as a result of Brexit or other factors?
Yeah, no, you're quite right, Richard. We did the flow of residual waste, black bag waste that we sent to Northern Europe peaked in 2017 at over 3 million tonnes. It started a few years above that, primarily as a result of tax escalations in the cost of landfill. Made it cheaper to send waste to Germany, to the Netherlands, to Scandinavian countries over a period of sort of 2012 through peak into 2017. We're still sending about 1 million tonnes today, this year, just over 1 million tonnes at the moment. But that has substantially reduced, primarily because each year in the UK since 2013, the sector has developed and delivered about 1 million tonnes of new capacity. Julie's just talked about what Enfinium's put into the market. There's been others as well. So we put 1 million tonnes of new capacity into the market, which has taken waste out of landfill, taken waste away from the Netherlands and Germany, where we've been exporting it to. And actually, we've still got 4 million tonnes of EFW capacity in construction at the moment. Probably slightly lower run rate for the next 4 years. Another 700,000 tonnes of waste will come out of landfill and probably out of export to Northern Europe, as the facilities that are currently in construction will come online 23, 24, 25, maybe early 26. So that's an important trend. We are becoming ever more or less reliant on landfill, and ever more self-sufficient in terms of the assets we've invested upon and put onto our own network. So that's what's fundamentally changing the pattern of what we've been sending to Northern Europe. And there's a few other shifts around similar timescales, really. Just sort of at a more macro level, Northern Europe, North America, in terms of plastics recycling, for many years We collected it, we sorted it, we sent far too many, millions and millions of tons of it out to Asia, out to China, in terms of what we're dealing with it. The Chinese stopped accepting significant quantities of mixed plastics in 2018. And there's been some progress in build out of plastic recycling infrastructure in Northern Europe and in the UK, but by some operators. Not enough though, and certainly not enough to replace what we used to send to places we perhaps shouldn't have sent them to, and certainly not enough to replace the plastic content or find an alternative outlet to the plastic content of the waste that Julia was talking about earlier that's coming into the waste to energy network. So, those will, I think there is a strong investment climate at the moment for more plastics recycling infrastructure, just as there is going to be there's an ongoing strong investment climate for the energy from waste plants that we've got in build at the moment and that will be coming online over the next 4 to 5 years.
So Chris, just to sort of put a finer point on that, I know something you think about quite a lot is the sort of residual waste treatment capacity gap. This is something that Tolvik has done tons of research on. So looking back a few years, we clearly had a massive treatment capacity gap because we were exporting lots of waste. There's still lots going to landfill. But what you're saying is we've built a lot more facilities. Enfinium, others have built those facilities. And so that capacity gap kind of comes down over time. Will we get to a point, or when will we get to a point where we have enough treatment capacity for all residual waste so we don't have to send anything to landfill? Are we getting close to that, or is it still sort of investable for people to build these energy from waste?
No, there's still a gap and a headroom for investment going forward. It's narrowing. It's probably becoming a bit more regionally specific. We have a lot of brownfield industrial sites in the north of England, which where a lot of projects have been coming forward and got to financial close and started building out on that. But we've got a significant part of our population lives in south of England, and in fact our growth of housing stock is much more skewed towards the housing southern England. So despite levelling up agendas and everything else, we've got housing growth in the south of England much stronger, but much more difficult to get planning permission for new facilities. Companies spend years and years and years trying to get planning permission, ultimately getting rejected at the end, sometimes for large industrial facilities, such as waste to energy plants that are actually going to be needed in the south of England. So there is a levelling up going to need to be done. There's work being done by people to think about perhaps more movement of waste on rail. But that's quite challenging in terms of finding the right rail heads, even if the right unloading arrangements are in place, getting actually loaded onto a train. Train pathways were quite short supply pre-pandemic. Now train pathways may be more available now with less people on trains going forward. And of course, moving all goods around by road is challenging, and moving rubbish around is just as challenging as moving everything else. So we are going to end up with a bit of an imbalance of probably a more balanced market in terms of waste arisings, less recycling in the north of England, and the capacity available to treat it. But we've still got a long-term structural deficit of capacity in the south of England, actually compounded by probably by 2025 we'll have no more landfill sites south of the M4, south of the River Thames, I'd say, going available to take waste that can't be sent to waste to energy or can't be recycled. So there's an interesting few years ahead of the sector in terms of managing that imbalance.
No, thanks for that, Chris. That's really helpful. I suppose I want to move us on to the sort of much more future gazing topic around the contribution of the waste sector to the decarbonisation agenda and to net zero specifically. I guess we've talked so far quite a lot about energy from waste, but that's obviously only one part of the waste activities in the wider sector, and more towards the sort of the lower part of the waste hierarchy, or the end of the pipe solution. So I suppose maybe Julia, if I can start with you, how do we go about decarbonising the waste sector? The waste sector is still responsible for some emissions, but it kind of feels like the waste sector should be a big part of our move to decarbonise, to improve the whole environmental performance of the UK. And is it about, presumably partly it's about energy from waste, but presumably we need to think a lot harder about recycling, about the real top of the waste hierarchy, about reuse. How much potential is there at that end? And then in a few minutes, we'll come back, I think, to talk about the role of energy from waste and negative emissions as well, talk about carbon capture and storage. But yeah, if we focus mostly first on the top part of the waste hierarchy, do you think there's more potential there for recycling and reuse? How can we unlock that?
Yeah, I mean, there definitely is. I think if you look at the waste industry in the UK, the industry has already done a fantastic job reducing emissions and the environmental impact that the waste sector has. Over 40% reduction in emissions in the last 10 years. And I think a lot of that has been through, exactly as you're saying, looking at what is the optimal use for material byproducts that us as human beings create every single day. And if you look at the waste hierarchy of reduce, reuse, recycle, and then recover energy, I think there has been a lot of focus on recycling to date. But as Chris said at the beginning of the discussion, that recycling rate really has stagnated recently. And so there does need to be continued investment in the infrastructure to support recycling, but there also needs to be an end market for those materials, and it's very heavily influenced by commodity cycles and making sure that there is an end user or a purchaser of that material. When we think about the areas and how we decarbonize across the entire sector, I think it has to be a combination of reducing the amount of waste that we produce, because less waste equals less carbon, means less processing and movement of waste, and it means less material that we need to find a way to manage if it cannot be recycled. We work very actively with our waste suppliers to understand how we can reduce the calorific value, and that means how can they be spending more time on front end processing. And so I think the large waste companies have a role, and they know that they have a role to play in removing that material, in particular things like rigid plastics, which I know a number of the large waste suppliers are really focused on investing in that moving forward. But then it's ultimately, there will be materials that cannot be, reduced, reused or recycled. And what do we do with that waste? And what's the most efficient use of that material? And it has to be recovering energy from that, as opposed to putting it into landfill and producing methane emissions, which are 26 times as potent as CO2. We recognise, though, clearly that the process of converting waste into electricity has a carbon impact. The waste has a carbon content, whether it's biogenic carbon or anthropogenic carbon. Carbon is part of the equation, and unfortunately with chemistry, 1 + 1 does not equal 0. So, we need to find and look at ways that we can, reduce the amount of the carbon footprint of the waste, both on the front end and the back end. And part of the solution that is being explored at the moment, and clearly is getting a lot of focus and attention within the energy sector, is whether carbon capture has a role to play in reducing the carbon output of waste to energy facilities.
Yeah, I want to bring us on to that. But before we go there, just briefly, maybe to bring in Chris, I suppose, so Julie, you're in some ways, in being a pure play energy from waste operator, you sort of receive certain wastes to treat on behalf of society, I guess, in some sense. But you don't have direct control over that, that the composition of that waste that you're receiving. That all sort of happens upstream from you. So you maybe aren't completely in control of all the levers there to do something to sort of change that, although you stress the importance of it. Chris, I wonder, I've always thought that there was a kind of big gap in waste policy, which is people talk about the waste hierarchy with reuse at the top, but there just seems so little attention on that from a policy direction. it never seems that we do very much about that. We talk a lot about recycling rates, but we don't even measure reuse of materials and products, do we?
No, it's very difficult to do. I mean, I think that there's more work being done by a number of parties involved in reuse schemes and recirculating of food from manufacturing businesses and retailers back into resale. But resale, it is difficult to measure because the world we live in is measured in kilograms and tons over on trucks over weighbridges. You know, from the local council that's going around collecting your stuff. We don't measure this so much in carbon terms or any, and if it's not there, it's difficult. If it's difficult to measure, I think what is interesting is really what role government's going to play in this or not. Just before Christmas, 3 years ago now, December 2018, we had a pretty groundbreaking strategy launched by UK government, which has been through at least 2 rounds of consultation so far, about making recycling easier, about moving the shift of cost away from government and local government through to retailers and producers, who of course may in turn pass that on to consumers. We'll see. So it was DEFRA launched a resources and waste strategy under the direction of the Secretary of State, Michael Gove at the time. We've been through 2 rounds of consultations so far. We're expecting a 3rd round of consultations next year, subject to other government priorities, of course, and it's a busy time for them. But so that was a strategy about making household recycling easier, more consistent, putting more obligations on businesses to undertake more recycling, moving the cost, recovering the cost of dealing with packaging waste in particular back to producers of packaging waste, and also some other stuff around potentially deposit return schemes, not really changing the amount of recycling done, in my opinion, just moving it from the green box outside one's houses through to the machines put outside the supermarket. So probably not a dull move in terms of change, but politically quite interesting for the government. So I think that strategy was talking about some fairly substantial changes, particularly to food waste recycling, plastic film recyclings in the period. Initially, it was forecast to be 23, 24 towards 28, 29. That's clearly gone back with pandemic, with other government priorities. I think what's going to be really interesting to me to see for all of us in the sector is going to be actually what's going to land in terms of those changes of obligations on local authorities, changes on obligations on businesses, how that's going to flow through the reuse, reduction, recycling, and then the residual waste markets. I'm slightly concerned that other government priorities might push this back, particularly when we get closer to election. There's some fairly complicated messaging in some of those recycling schemes, but we'll see. But that's the thing that's going to next move the dial in terms of, and it's probably a 5-year implementation period.
Yeah, it does seem crazy that we still have such a mishmash of kind of waste collection schemes around the country. It seems like there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in what you've said, Chris. But yeah, as you say, it's just whether the governments will have the attention on that, whether it becomes a critical enough issue. I'm going to come back, I said on the CCS question, but before we go there, there's one other topic which I think it seems to be sort of going up the radar of a lot of people in the waste sector at the moment, and it relates to this topic about decarbonisation, is the question of an incinerator tax. Incinerator is sort of a dirty word within the sector itself, but there is talk of an incinerator tax, and this is in place in some other countries. So as we have a tax on waste going into landfill, there is an argument that if you wanted to reduce the emissions from energy from waste, you could do that through some form of incineration tax. I don't know, it'd be good to find out both of your views on that. Maybe Julia, if you come in first. I mean, you'll be subject to this tax. It wouldn't surprise me if you said this is a bad idea, but what would be the argument for why it wouldn't work?
I mean, look, taxes work in certain ways, and ultimately an incineration tax would result in an increase in cost to the consumer. So if that's what the tax is trying to do, then I think it would be effective in doing that. The reality is that waste to energy facilities' primary objective is to provide disposal capacity for waste that cannot be recycled. There's a landfill tax because we can actually avoid the majority of materials going to landfill. But without having waste to energy as part of a sustainable waste management infrastructure solution, we don't have somewhere to process that waste today. And so therefore, as long as the landfill tax is larger than an incinerator tax, it will continue to incentivize, waste collection organizations to dispose at waste to energy facilities, because we do provide incredibly reliable operations. We do operate 24/7, and we do have the capacity to accept, the large volumes of waste in very strategic locations. And so ultimately what that tax would do would be passed through into the contracts and ultimately end up with the, consumer bearing the cost of that, which again is, I think a very interesting conversation when we talk about, what really is going to drive a change in the waste sector. It has to be from the consumer's behavior. And so if we are going to charge people more for waste disposal, regardless of where that is, then maybe that does, incentivize people to think differently about the products that they purchase, the way in which they treat their waste. But, I think unfortunately the reality is that it will be borne by, the organizations as opposed to the end consumers.
I agree with Julia, but I think we've also got to be careful of the unintended consequences of any new taxation.
Yeah.
We've had a very successful landfill tax. It's the highest in Europe, but it's driven huge amounts of investment in new waste to energy technology to prevent waste going to landfill and having a carbon impact of 84 times methane. But of course, if we then apply a tax to that, either waste could, without a corresponding increase in tax to landfill, you could see waste at best going off back to landfill, some tonnages, which is actually defeating the objective. Or worse still, there are only two things legally we can do with waste. That's either put it to waste to energy plants or send it to a landfill. This is residual waste. There's a bunch of illegal activity out of the scope in there. And then, of course, any increases in taxation, as we know from many other tax worlds, can increase the amount of illegal activity. We've got a big enough problem at the moment in many European countries with illegal management of residual waste. So that's what Treasury's got to work through. I know they're looking at that. I know they're minded on that in terms of it. I'm probably less. I think the wider carbon tax probably has got more of a potential remit into this than necessarily just an incineration tax.
Yeah.
But we'll have to watch that one and plan it through. But it's the unintended consequences that need to be considered fully. Absolutely.
So thinking about this carbon question and flipping it round, we've mentioned it a couple of times already, but there's this topic rising up the agenda in the waste sector, which is about the potential of energy from waste to incorporate carbon capture and storage and therefore be a negative emitter in a sense, depending on how you're accounting for these things. This seems to be a topic that was not on the agenda at all 2 years ago in the waste sector, but has come up to be pretty important. And I guess my take on that is, with the net zero strategy, there's a recognition from the UK government that we are going to need a significant volume of negative emissions in their own numbers, something in the order of 80 megatons a year in 2050 to make the numbers add up. That is to say, we will still have positive emissions in certain sectors, really hard to abate activities such as aviation industry and so forth. And then there'll be other sectors that provide negative emissions, and so it all balances off to zero. That's basically the plan. The problem is we need to find now 80 megatons of negative emissions per year by 2050. Can the waste sector be part of that? Julia, are you looking at this for any of your facilities? Is it viable technically, economically?
Today, no. I think, are we looking at it? Yes. Exactly as you said, 12 months ago, if you'd asked me about carbon capture, I would have said that we will be a fast follower. We're now, given how the public perception, the policy dialogue, and the industries are coming out and positioning the role of carbon capture, we are actively exploring opportunities to understand the viable technologies, if there are any, and how we could potentially pilot this at some of our existing facilities. I think the challenge that we have in the waste to energy industry is going back to the feedstock and the fact that our fuel supply is not homogeneous. So if you're designing a solution to try and capture carbon from flue gases that every minute have a different potential composition of those flue gases based on the waste stream, it can be very challenging to do so. And I know that there are some smaller scale units that are starting to be piloted, and there's been a lot of investment in R&D into the space and technology. But for where we sit today, there is not a technology that is of the right scale to capture all of the emissions from our facilities, at least, in an economic way that can actually be implemented in a timely manner.
So Chris, briefly, what do you think needs to happen? Well, what does government need to do to make energy from waste with CCS a reality?
Yeah, I think government's doing some stuff in this place in terms of working through their potential subsidy support options under the ICC business model, for where there's the ability to connect to other transport and storage infrastructure. Because what we need to avoid is having, and there are 71 waste to energy plants around the UK, all in different places. And generally they generate a ton of CO2 for a ton of waste putting in. So if we've got a truck bringing in a load of waste, we don't really want to put too many more trucks on the road trying to then remove the CO2 to take it to a transfer and storage hub. Where there are some large waste to energy plants, which there are, which in an ability to connect through to the T&S hubs, I think that's absolutely a valid, possibly valid project to explore, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's a lot that needs to happen in policy terms to make CCS happen anywhere at all in the UK. There's a big gap there. Government's obviously looking at it and has put in place a structure for CCS in the power sector, or is putting in place that structure. But I think as we want to extend this to other activities such as energy from waste, it still needs a lot of policy development, I think, to make this happen.
I think it also needs all the players to come together, right? We spent a lot of time today talking about the waste sector and then the energy sector, where the reality is that waste to energy straddles both. And so any of the decisions that we make about how carbon emissions from an energy generation perspective are managed or monitored or taxed or incentivized needs to go hand in hand with understanding the drivers and support for continuing to divert waste away from landfill. So I agree. I think there's a lot of policy discussion. There's a lot of industry discussion. There's a lot of large companies in the private and public sector conversations that need to happen to really design a solution that's going to be fit for purpose. Because, as Chris said, if we're not located in close proximity to any of these transportation hubs or areas or solutions, does investing in carbon capture make any sense?
Yeah, it's something that the waste or energy from waste companies are not going to deliver on their own, for sure. It needs to be part of a much broader projects, as you say, industrial clusters where CCS is being looked at, and by the very nature of that, it will require a huge amount of coordination between different parties, which I think it is industry coordinating with itself, but I see a very large role for government to do that coordination and bring it all together to underpin some of the risks that straddle across the different parties, to underpin the investment in the CO2 transport and storage infrastructure, for example, and put in place arrangements that allow a range of different operators to put their CO2 into those stores. It's hugely complicated. Actually, as you think about it more and more, but it does seem that the volume of negative emissions from energy from waste could be quite significant. So we've covered a huge amount of ground there on sort of the short-term challenges and dynamics with COVID, with Brexit, with other things, but also the long-term about where the waste sector is headed and the potential around decarbonisation. It's been really interesting to talk to you both. As with every Aurora podcast, we will end with the usual over-underrated questions, where I will ask you about a certain thing, and you need to tell me whether you think it's overrated or underrated. So, Julia, I wanted to ask you about advanced conversion technologies. For anyone who doesn't know about these are technologies such as gasification and pyrolysis of waste, which are different ways of treating residual waste that don't involve burning it, as far as I understand. Are these technologies overrated or underrated, Julia?
As an operator of waste to energy facilities, I would say overrated. I think the reality is that they have a role to play in certain specific environments where you have a very homogeneous fuel supply, you have a very small scale operation, and you have a very clear offtake solution for the byproduct. Do they have the ability to replace waste to energy from a scale, efficiency, effectiveness, reliability perspective? No.
And certainly from the reliability, we have seen a few schemes that have not operated as expected. Okay, Chris, your question, overrated or underrated deposit return schemes?
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you, Richard. I think I'm going to have to go overrated again. I think the deposit return schemes are going to be a very expensive way to achieve just a little bit more recycling of a few fizzy drinks bottles. Government projections are £1 billion rollout cost for deposit return schemes. My view is that there are much better ways of spending that money on more needy aspects of infrastructure for improving recycling of reduction and recycling of household waste than some fancy vending machines outside supermarkets.
I would tend to agree with you, Chris. Yeah, could be.
So do I.
Okay.
Resounding consensus.
Interesting. Not a consensus in the industry. Lots of people pushing for these deposit return schemes. So anyway, maybe we're a bit out of consensus with the wider industry. Who knows? Anyway, thank you both so much for joining the podcast. It's been fascinating to speak to you. Brilliant. Thanks so much.
Good. Very well. Very nice to meet both Julia and Richard again.
Yeah. Thank you.
That was Richard Howard, Research Director at Aurora, talking to Julia Watsford, CEO at Enfinium, and Chris Jonas, Director at Tolvik Consulting. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.